In this discussion, I'm going to talk about author James Joyce and specifically his short story Araby. So a little bit of background on this author. So James Joyce was born in Dublin, Ireland, and you can see his dates are 1882 to 1941. He is noted as a modernist writer, and he is, celebrated as for his experimental use of language, and particularly in his later works like Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, where he developed a kind of stream of consciousness technique. At the time that he was writing, he was often not appreciated for his innovativeness, and he was also sort of criticized for his kind of critical view of Ireland and Dublin when he wrote many of the short stories. He sort of criticized Dublin, and we'll talk a little bit about that in relation to the text Araby. So he grew up the eldest of 10 children. We learn a little bit about, if you read the biography, that he suffered in his childhood. His family suffered through poverty and his father's alcoholism. He was also, again, grew up as a child strongly immersed in the Roman Catholic faith, as an Irish Catholic family. So Catholicism is another sort of theme or idea that we see that's prevalent in his writing. And Araby, as I mentioned, is a short story by James Joyce, and that's the one we're going to discuss in this video. And it was originally published in a chapter in his work, The Dubliners, which was published in 1914. So let's take a closer look at this short story. So the short story Araby, it's featured in a lot of anthologies, so I thought I would discuss it so everybody can sort of get an idea of what this text is about. It's written from the perspective of a young boy, so the boy is the narrator, and he's sort of looking back now as in sort of retrospection at himself when he was a young boy. The story is basically, so a synopsis or summary is about this boy who lives in Dublin, Ireland, and it's kind of a depressing, depiction of the town, the city. And he, as we learn, he's at the brink of his sort of adolescence, maybe 12 years old, just starting to sort of transition from child to adolescent or adult. And we see him sort of infatuated with the girl who lives across the street. She's the sister of his friend Mannion, and she doesn't have a name in the text. Her name is just Mannion's sister. And the girl mentions to him, they don't talk a lot, but when they do, the girl mentions that she would like to attend the Araby. And we learn that the Araby is this bazaar, this kind of celebration, this marketplace that is at the edge of the town. So he would have to travel, across the river, take the train to go visit this marketplace, this exotic marketplace or bazaar at the edge of town. She cannot go, so he promises to go and bring something back for her. And he sort of sees this as his mission or pursuit to bring back this gift that he promises to this girl that he is in love with. And he hopes, again, this gesture will be somehow, a symbol of their love, or the love he has for her, and he believes maybe is reciprocated. And then on the day that he is to go to the bazaar, first he's delayed by his uncle, so it's not until, it's nearly, 9 o'clock when his uncle gets home, and the Araby, the bazaar, closes at 10, so he's very late. And then when he finally gets to the event, it's just shutting down, or in the process of shutting down. There are lights off, all the vendors are putting away their wares, and it's again not what he expected, and he ends up disappointed, not buying anything, and he ends up having this sort of moment of recognition of disappointment in the bazaar, but also in himself. So that's basically the story is quite a simple story on the surface, but again, when we dig deeper, we can sort of see larger themes and ideas represented in this text. The main characters, so I mentioned that the narrator is a boy who's, again, maybe 12 years old or, on the brink from sort of on the cusp of adolescence. So he's not a child anymore, but he's not quite an adult. And he's going through those, rite of passage that happens in adolescence when you maybe fall in love with somebody for the first time, or you start having, sexual feelings. You start sort of growing up, maturing, and you kind of give up a lot of those fantasies of or imagination of childhood. There are other characters, including Mannion, who is the name of the boy's friend, and they play together in the front street. And it's Mannion's sister who he has this crush on. She doesn't have a name, so she's just known as Mannion's sister, but that's who the boy is in love with. And he kind of imagines scenarios where she's in love with him as well, and she becomes this kind of object of fascination for him, and he is infatuated with her. Other characters include the narrator's aunt and uncle, so he seems to live with his aunt and uncle. There's really sort of no mention of his parents, which again maybe just leads us to sort of say there's sort of underlying sort of sadness to the narrative and the depiction of family. The setting is an important part of the story, so we have two separate settings in the same town, of course. So Dublin is the main setting, but two sort of starkly contrasting settings within that. The first setting is just the street, Richmond Street, and it's described at the start of the story. So North Richmond Street being blind, which you learn is just, if you have a text, it usually has a footnote on it that tells us that a blind street refers to a dead-end street. So again, dead end could be sort of symbolic of a kind of depressed atmosphere, a dead end in life. You don't have a lot of hope or dreams for the future if you're in a dead end situation. And all the houses sort of stood facing each other, so he could live in one side of the street and look down and see Mannion's sister come out and call them from the front stoop of their house walkway. And the children would play again in the streets. But the description of the setting of their houses does sort of imply or give an atmosphere of kind of depression. It's a quiet street. There's not a lot of activity until the school lets out. And there's the houses are described in a kind of personification at the end of the first paragraph, where he says, the other houses on the street, conscious of decent lives within them, gazed at one another with brown, imperturbable faces. So they kind of gives human characteristics to the houses in that sentence. And in his house, he says, the former tenant of the house where he lives is a priest who had died in the back drawing room of the house, and it's very sort of musty in that room, but there's old papers, and he finds some of the old books that the priest would have read. And he talks a little bit about how the garden behind the house has an apple tree, and he finds this old rusty bicycle pump, and he talks a little bit about this dead priest who used to live in the house where he lives. So that's sort of his Dublin. He talks again, he describes how the streets and the houses had a sort of somber atmosphere. There's a feeble light from the lanterns. It was largely a silent street, dark muddy lanes, the back doors of the dark dripping gardens. There's ash pits and dark odorous stables. So a lot of dark imagery is conveyed in that description of the street and of Dublin. And that's sort of in contrast to what the bazaar represents in the story. So a bazaar, or the Araby, as it's called, an Arab bazaar, Araby bazaar, is, or it can be defined as a marketplace. It's usually a sort of very celebratory atmosphere, lively, full of people, um, maybe exotic goods from other countries, and it's a bustling marketplace. The term bazaar and the word Araby has connotations of Middle East. So you could imagine a kind of Middle Eastern marketplace where there's vendors, and I found this image here where there's, you can see sort of vendors walking down the hall, or, a lot of bustling crowds and vendors selling their wares, whether it's, little vases or trinkets or cloths, everything sort of colorful and vibrant. And again, this would be a stark contrast to the kind of dreary life that is the norm for children in this Dublin street. So the bazaar has a kind of almost symbolic, dreamlike, fantasy-like symbolism in the story, where it represents maybe the possibility of this magical place where amazing things can happen and you can kind of escape the reality of your dreary, somber life. So you could, and some critics have talked about this as a kind of example of Orientalism. And if you want to read more about that, you can look up Edward Said's text, Orientalism, where he describes how the Orient, or the Middle East, or parts of Asia were sort of perceived or conveyed through a lens of being exotic, or of being opposite of the West, Western culture. So whether that's, exotic or unusual, all of these sort of qualities that make it other. So yeah, the Araby and the bazaar becomes a kind of magical place in the mind of this boy, and it will be a sort of a point of disillusionment in his life when he finally realizes what the bazaar is. So we'll talk a little bit more about that at the ending. In terms of Joyce, what he was trying to sort of convey in this story and other stories, Araby was part of his collection, The Dubliners, or his short stories, Dubliners, which was published in 1914. And of that work, he talks about, how the different chapters in Dubliners were, they each tell a different story about different people in Dublin, but there's this sort of central theme that runs through all of the stories, and it is, he talks about that in this quotation where he says, "My intention was to write a chapter of the moral history of my country, and I chose Dublin for the scene because the city seemed to me the center of paralysis." So that word paralysis becomes a kind of theme or idea in these stories. And paralysis, you think of that, maybe you hear that word and you think maybe of being stuck, of being unable to move forward. If you're paralyzed, you can't move. And so that he sort of conveys that idea and lays that on top of the city of Dublin as being somehow stuck and in this sort of place frozen in time. And it's not a healthy atmosphere, and he sort of wants to convey that sense of paralysis through the characters in his story. So keep that in mind as well when you're reading Araby, how the boy also maybe embodies this idea of paralysis in his actions, or in this case, lack of actions. So the central theme of Araby is this idea of coming of age, or loss of innocence is another way to put that. So the term, coming of age is often refers to that transitional period when you're no longer a child and you're moving into a more mature realization about yourself and about the world. So that happens during adolescence, and adolescence doesn't last, it lasts a couple of years. You move from being a child and believing in fantasies and having a vivid imagination and believing in magic and, all those things, like, you believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and all those things that children believe in. You kind of lose that innocent view of the world as you move into your teenage years and then eventually into adult maturity. So that process is a kind of loss where you're losing that part of yourself that believes in something magical or has hope or optimism or that kind of pure innocence of a child. And it's also a time of gaining knowledge. So you lose your innocence, but you gain knowledge or you gain experience as you move through the world as an adolescent or a teenager. So you're gaining maybe knowledge about the world around you, you're gaining knowledge about yourself, and it can be a kind of sobering realization about what the world is really like. It's maybe not the magical place that you once thought it was, and it can be a sad transition as well in that realization. So the theme coming of age is going to be very prevalent in this text. You might refer to that as also a loss of innocence. And that's a common theme in a lot of texts where the narrator, who's a child, loses their sense of innocent views of the world around them. And that's kind of what we get in this text as well. The narrator, who's this young boy, loses his innocent view of the world and of himself through this experience of going to the bazaar, the Araby, and visiting that place and seeing what it really is. Oops. So the theme, you might also say or refer to it as a sense of disillusionment. So if we break this word down, illusion is the middle of it. So if you have an illusion about something, or you are looking at something as a fantasy, the process of disillusionment is the loss of that fantasy. So that's this feeling that the boy experiences when he eventually goes to the bazaar. He gets a sense of disillusionment when he feels the sense of disappointment when he finally sees that everything is closing up and it's not what he thought it was going to be. It's not this magical place. It's just a run-of-the-mill market run by a bunch of English teenagers or whoever else are at the marketplace. He thought it was going to be something exotic and magical, and he ends up disappointed with that discovery. So let's, you might also, apply this disillusionment to the love that he seems to feel, or he begins to feel for Mannion's sister. She's the source of sort of conflict in the story. She's the one he's sort of invested his feelings in. She's the central figure who he's motivated to go buy something for at the bazaar. And it's also a sense of disillusionment that he experiences in relation to her character when he realizes that, the love that he thinks exists between them, it doesn't exist at all, and that he's just sort of been kidding himself, and he has this experience as a feeling of disappointment in himself for believing a childish belief like love exists between them. So there's lots of different sort of symbols and motifs in the text. Like I mentioned before, the Araby Bazaar is the central symbol. It's the title of the story, and it represents this perception, an illusion of something magical and fantastic and exotic, but the reality is when he finally does get there, it is a disappointment. So once he finally gets there, he finds the stalls were mostly closed and large parts of the bazaar are in darkness. It's very quiet. There's very few people there, and many of the stalls are closed. And when he finally goes to one of the stalls that seems open, it's just a young lady with an English accent laughing with two gentlemen, and she doesn't really want to serve him. She doesn't take him seriously as a buyer, and he eventually doesn't buy anything at the bazaar, even though he's promised Mannion's sister that he would. So he's in a state of paralysis at that moment. He doesn't buy anything, so that's sort of the twist. He goes all the way there and then ends up not purchasing the gift for the girl. It's also probable that he didn't have enough money at that time. The goods were too expensive. There's not a lot of choice left. And then the girl, like I said, the teenage girl who's asking him if he wants to buy anything, she's not really interested in selling to him. She doesn't really take him seriously. And she's engaged in this other conversation, sort of flirting with these two other young boys. The color symbolism, there is color symbolism as well. A lot of critics have talked about the color brown, and that sort of connotes a kind of the dreariness of Dublin. The houses are described with their personification, with having brown, imperturbable faces. And also Mannion's sister is described as having sort of a brown dress on, and she's referred to as the brown figure. So his whole infatuation with Mannion's sister, he doesn't have a lot of interaction with her. He mostly just sort of views her from afar, whether he sees her out the window when he looks out the window, or he spies on her when he sort of hides in the shadow and watches her as she calls for her brother and for them to come in for supper. When they walk to school, he walks behind her, and it refers to her as her brown figure. I kept her brown figure always in my eye, and when we came near the point at which our ways diverged, I quickened my pace and passed her. So I never had spoken to her except for a few casual words, and yet her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood. So he's infatuated with her, even though he's never really talked to her, and he refers to her as a brown figure, sort of in the shadow, that she's sort of like an object that he can't completely grasp fully, and she becomes this kind of maybe put on a pedestal for him, somebody that he adores but doesn't have a real relationship at all with. The color brown, some critics have also noted that its association with the Araby Bazaar, with Middle Eastern people, sort of brown, the color brown, like brown skin, could represent a kind of exoticism, and here again the idea of Orientalism plays a role, but this idea that brown can be both the somberness of Dublin, but also the perception of something maybe exotic, like Mannion's sister, or like the Middle Eastern bazaar, and maybe the disappointment of that as well. Irish versus English, you'll also notice the motif just in terms of Ireland and its place historically. If you know anything about Irish history, you'll know that Ireland was actually a sort of British colony, and there's often a lot of antagonism, or there has been historically, between the Irish and the British, or the English. So there's this colonial divide between Irish and their colonists, the British. So there is this connotation as well within the story. There's little hints that Joyce drops of a kind of animosity between the Irish and the English. As it turns out, when the boy visits the Araby, he's expecting again an exotic marketplace. He's got fantasies of Middle Eastern people selling their wares, and in the end, it just turns out to be this young English girl who's trying to, who doesn't really seem interested in selling him anything, and kind of maybe looks down on him for being Irish. And he noticed the English accents of the girl and the young men when she's talking to them. So it is a kind of disappointment that he feels, where his idea of this exotic marketplace is nothing but a young English lady selling some vases and jars and whatnot. It doesn't have that kind of magical quality that he thought it was going to have. So there's that kind of sense of disappointment and that context implied there. Catholicism is another major sort of motif in the text. We know that Catholicism, Irish Catholicism, is prevalent in Joyce's life when he was a young man. And if you grew up in a sort of Irish or a Catholic family, there's a lot of religious rituals and ideas of faith and practices that are, symbolized in the story. So there's lots of different sort of symbolic elements that tell us about the narrator's Catholicism and the role that it plays in his life. One of the main ones, the first ones, was he describes the former tenant of our house, a priest who had died in the back drawing room. So this priest that had died, again, it's a little detail. You might just read it and think it's insignificant, but again, it plays a larger sort of symbolic role in establishing the presence of Catholicism in this boy's life and how it kind of hangs over the story. It could be read also allegorically. You might see Catholicism run through the text as a kind of subtext in the narrative. So the dead priest, who it's also noted there's an apple tree in the back wild garden of the house. An apple tree could also be sort of symbolic of the Garden of Eden, the tree of knowledge, and the fall of man. So Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge and suffering a fall or loss of innocence. And we know that the theme of loss of innocence is very evident in this text. And then the bazaar itself, when he goes to the Araby, it was also described almost like a church after service. So he says the silence, the darkness was the same that he recognized when after church everybody leaves the church and there's sort of this dead atmosphere, a silence and darkness that sort of overtakes that once bustling atmosphere. So there's this also possibly an allegorical level to the story where he's also disappointed in a way by his Catholicism. And it's a loss of innocence in terms of his loss of faith maybe as well. There's a lot of different linking themes with Catholicism and his sexuality. So as a young man who's again on the brink of adolescence, he has a lot of sexual feelings that are emerging. He's no longer a child. And when you're 12, 13, you start having those feelings, sexual feelings and desires, and that's where we see him in his kind of infatuation with his friend's sister. And there's scenes that, or quotes in the story that sort of show us how he's kind of conflating or confusing his religious faith and his sexual obsession with Mannion's sister. And he views her as almost as if she was an object to be worshipped. So he's kind of confusing his religious faith with his sexuality and what he wants from Mannion's sister. So a couple of examples there. The way he thinks of her name like a summons. The way he imagines her, he says, her name sprang to my lips at moments in strange prayers and praises, which I myself did not understand. So the word prayers and praises, that's how you would, you pray to God or you praise God, but it's not God that he's praying to, it's this girl's name that he's praying for or that he's praising. So he's sort of replaced God in his prayers, and this girl's, his obsession with the girl has now sort of replaced that as his religious obsession. And he completely adores her, yet he doesn't have a real relationship with her, right? She's kind of this idealized figure who he doesn't have a strong, realistic, concrete connection with. And in fact, he's only sort of talked with her, maybe, has one tiny conversation with her at all. They exchange a few words. There's also this description when he goes into the back room, again, where the priest's room was. So one evening I went into the back drawing room in which the priest had died. It was a dark, rainy evening, and there was no sound in the house. And then he says, I was thankful that I could see so little. All my senses seemed to desire to veil themselves, and feeling that I was about to slip from them, I pressed my palms of my hands together until they trembled, murmuring, oh love, many times. So he kind of, instead of praying the way a priest would pray to God, he prays for love, oh love, oh love. And it's kind of, again, showing us that for this young boy, Mannion's sister, this girl, has sort of become his religion in a way. It's she who he adores, it's she who occupies his, every waking thought. She's a distraction, she becomes his kind of obsession. And when they finally do have a conversation, again, it's very short. He's at his friend's house, and she addresses him, and he first is paralyzed. He doesn't know what to say. So again, another example of paralysis. When she addressed the first words to me, I was so confused that I did not know what to answer. So you can imagine a young boy. He's being addressed by the girl he has a crush on. He doesn't know what to say. That's a common thing that you might experience if you're a teenager. She asked me if I was going to Araby. I forgot whether I answered yes or no. And then he finally musters up enough sort of courage to ask, and why can't you go? She says she is busy, that she has a retreat that week in her convent. So again, the presence of Catholicism in their lives. He says, if I go, I will bring something. I will bring you something. So that's his kind of promise to her. But again, they only exchange maybe a couple of words here, and yet he has invested so much in this relationship. It's become a kind of obsession to him. And now he has a sense of purpose. He's going to bring her a gift. He's going to travel to this bazaar, and it's going to be sort of a sign or symbol of his love for her and of their burgeoning relationship, or that's what he hopes or dreams it will be. And then there's also one more thing in terms of their relationship. Joyce also uses kind of medieval tropes, like a knight going on a quest in his depiction of this young boy. So he's also maybe immature in that way, that he views himself as kind of on this holy quest, and views himself as kind of driven by this mission to bring back a trophy that he's going to give to this girl, and that's going to be a sign or symbol of his love for her. And there's certain little hints that Joyce also gives in the story that tell us that there's this sort of medieval tropes, like a medieval knight who's on a quest, and that's how the boy views himself. So that's another kind of subtext or motif that Joyce is using in the story. And as we talked about, there at the ending of the short story, the boy does not end up buying anything at the bazaar, and it becomes this kind of disappointment or disappointing experience. And he's again caught in a kind of paralysis where he's not able to buy anything, and he ends up feeling sort of frustrated with himself and disappointed. So he ends up, I think, he finally gets to the bazaar late, and his uncle has kept him from leaving because he hasn't shown up with money yet. So he's maybe in a way also disappointed by his uncles in that sense. And then eventually he's also disappointed by the Araby itself, by the bazaar. So he viewed it, he was going to see it as something magical, or that's how he perceived it, and then when he finally gets there, it's not what he expected, and it's disappointing. And then he says no thank you, he's not going to buy anything. After all this effort and time that he's put in, all the thought that he's been, thinking of getting this gift for this girl, he ends up not buying her anything. And it is a kind of loss of innocence or epiphany moment for him. So an epiphany refers to a moment, a kind of light bulb moment when a light goes on in your mind, or you have a sudden grasp of reality, or make a grand realization about yourself or about the world around you. And that's sort of what happens for this boy, this narrator. The last line of the short story tells us that he sort of has a light bulb moment when he realizes that he's come all this way to this bazaar. He's viewed it as something magical, and that it's going to be a great moment where he proves his love to Mannion's sister, and then it becomes none of that. So I'll just read you the last sort of part of the short story. So I turned and away slowly and walked down the middle of the bazaar. I allowed the 2 pennies to fall against the 6pence in my pocket. I heard a voice call from one end of the gallery that the light was out. The upper part of the hall was now completely dark. Gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. So a couple of things in that moment. The pennies dropping could also be a symbolic moment. Maybe the fact that he doesn't have enough money to buy anything is also part of this disappointment. But the pennies fall could be a sort of, symbolic of the fall that he also experiences, his fall or loss of innocence. And now he's, the atmosphere around him is completely dark. And he says, gazing up to the darkness, I saw myself. So he has this moment of realization about himself. And he now views himself not as a knight in shining armor, or a knight on a quest, or a man, driven to prove his love on a mission. He sees himself as a sort of pitiful creature, driven and derided by vanity. And his eyes burned with anguish and anger. So it is a kind of fall that he's experienced or experiences in relation to his own self-image. He's no longer viewing himself as kind of a hero, a heroic figure. He's not on some great quest. He's not able to fulfill the goal that he had, which was to buy the object, his gift, and give it to the girl he loves. He's failed. So he's kind of humiliated in the sense of failure, and he sees this, his efforts as being vain, as foolish, that he's been a fool this whole time. And in a way, it's a realization that the girl he loves, that's based on nothing as well, that's been an illusion in itself. So this relationship that he's sort of built in his mind between himself and Mannion's sister, that relationship doesn't really exist in reality. It's all kind of an illusion, childhood kind of illusion that he is forced to give up in this moment when he realizes the truth about himself and the truth about his fantasy relationship. And his eyes burned with anguish and anger. So he's angry with himself, and he's, again, in anguish, suffering, sad that this is a loss that he is experiencing. So yeah, it's a kind of dark story in a way about a young boy who has to give up some of the childhood fantasies that he's been carrying, and they have to do with his views of love, his infatuation with a girl, and also his disappointment with a kind of magical or fantasy life that we associate with childhood. That is also lost in that moment. So it's again a loss of innocence conveyed in that ending. You might be a little confused when you're reading this. Derided by vanity. A lot of students might see vanity as being solely associated with vanity, like you're vain, you think of yourself, you're obsessed with the way you look. But it has, again, a larger connotation in terms of maybe the human experience. It's vain to sort of try to step beyond our humanity to achieve something that's beyond our means. And if we're just creatures, maybe that's what we are. We're not gods. So he's maybe, it's a kind of humbling moment for himself when he views himself as driven purely by a kind of illusion or fantasy. And it's driven by a kind of vanity that he could that she's maybe in love with him, or that this simple gift is going to allow him to have a relationship with the woman he loves. And it's kind of, he realizes his own naivety in thinking that. So he's kind of been naive this whole time. And that's part of being a child, is you kind of are naive. You don't really fully realize the reality of the situation. And you look at the world innocently and through hopeful optimism, and kind of look to the best. And here he kind of has this deep sense of disappointment in himself and in the world around him.